Who on earth is Curtis Yarvin, and why should we care about him?
Curtis Yarvin is a blogger and computer programmer whose extremist anti-democracy writings in the early 2000s spawned these movements known as the Dark Enlightenment and the neo-reactionary movement. And these ideas, unfortunately, have become a lot more important and popular with certain Silicon Valley billionaires in recent years, and in many ways form the basis of some of the dynamics we're seeing now with Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, with Doge, the experiment to have Elon Musk run the federal bureaucracy and do as much destruction as possible, and with Trump's weird new idea for things like freedom cities. And so this obscure blogger who really should have been an internet troll that no one had ever heard of is suddenly, you can trace a lot of the ideas, a lot of the destruction that's happening right now in our politics back to his writings and to the influence he's had on some very powerful people in Silicon Valley and connected to Silicon Valley, namely J.D. Vance.
Okay, so can you walk us through the Dark Enlightenment, for example, and the way people like Curtis Yarvin are thinking about American politics and American society?
Sure. The key to understanding Yarvin's writings is that he overtly defines democracy as a bad system. He sees democracy as the enemy. And he overtly calls for a return to monarchy or dictatorship. He sees those as superior systems and doesn't understand why they were abandoned. He believes democracy is a failed experiment. And he advocates for a new system, a sort of post-United States world, where instead of having one nation or one democracy, we have these little corporate-run fiefdoms called SovCorps or sovereign corporations that would basically be companies would control territory, and instead of being a citizen, you would be a customer, and the corporation would have total power over the citizen. Even if they wanted to kill you, basically, that would be within their rights. And your right, allegedly, would be able to just choose to live in another sovereign corporate territory. For example, he, in one of his writings, something called Patchworks, laid out a plan for a future San Francisco called Frisk Corp, where everyone is under constant and total surveillance at all times in order to assure their security. And you had to have to scan into town and scan out, even if you were coming over the bridge from Oakland, and where even perhaps unproductive people or the underclass could be turned into biodiesel to fuel the buses, or else, he says he's joking about that, locked into virtual reality cells for the rest of their lives. So this very dark dystopian vision. And as crazy as it sounds, this idea of creating a post-United States, post-democracy era has become increasingly popular in Silicon Valley. And you can trace a lot of these ideas back to a 1997 book called The Sovereign Individual. And The Sovereign Individual, it's going to sound real crazy at first, but I'll explain why it matters. It predicted that in the 21st century, the information age would eliminate most jobs, and that the rise of something called cybercurrency would enable certain very talented and wealthy individuals from tech, who they termed a cognitive elite, to rise up and become the rightful rulers of their own territories. And as nutty as all of that sounds, this book had a massive effect and influence on a guy named Peter Thiel, who as early as 1999 was giving speeches talking about how this new form of currency would emerge and would allow for people to evade taxes and regulations and would undermine the power of existing governments. And the book had such an impression on Thiel that in 2020, when it was reissued, he wrote the preface for it. His name, if you go and look up The Sovereign Individual on any online book site, you'll see preface by Peter Thiel. And if you understand what's in that crazy book, then you're really going to get interested in why is Peter Thiel having such an effect on our government now. So flash forward, Yarvin, about 10 years later, starts his writings. And what he's largely doing is fleshing out a political theory and an idea for how to bring about this dystopian world ruled by tech that was predicted in The Sovereign Individual.
Okay,
And
so
that's kind of the basis of it.
Okay, so let me step back for a minute. So if you think about the establishment of nation states in human society, that happens about 400 years ago. And we get the idea of governments, and governments oversee the people who live within their countries. And they do things like create money and create defense systems and create social welfare systems and so on. What you're suggesting is that these tech bros, if you will, the very wealthy tech people, are relying on an ideology that developed in the 1990s primarily and that Curtis Yarvin is fleshing out to break down the idea of those nation states and create a new kind of human society in which they are the people who call all the shots. Am I right so far?
Exactly.
Okay, so I just have to ask, who is Curtis Yarvin? Where did he come from? Because I've read a lot of his stuff, thanks to you often, and it's meandering. It's not very clear. It seems like it's really quite poor history and not a terribly good understanding of philosophy or facts. Where does he come from? What were his influences? Do we have any idea?
Well, he was largely raised outside of Washington, D.C. His parents both worked for the government, which is interesting because he hates the federal government in particular. He went to college at a very young age and was a sort of prodigy in that way. But then he moved out to California, to the Bay Area and San Francisco, got into tech, had some success there, and was able to sort of, in the early 2000s, sit around thinking of new ideas for how to run the world. And that is pretty much the basis of his, that's his, no, he doesn't have a PhD in history. He doesn't really have much of a grasp of history. A lot of what he talks about is just directly wrong. For instance, he says that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was essentially a dictator, which is, I don't think any historian would accept that. But again, a lot of the basis of the ideology he's been promoting doesn't make sense, but that doesn't seem to matter to the people who like how it sounds. And basically this idea of creating this new future where liberal democracy no longer exists and the hierarchies of the old world are permanently installed is the basis of what's called the neo-reactionary movement, or the Dark Enlightenment. The Dark Enlightenment because we give up on, we've decided that all this progress and democracy stuff didn't work. One of the adherents of these ideas called it basically an outdated software system. And so they think they're creating a new software system for the future, which basically sounds a lot like tech fascism, at the very least, very severe authoritarianism. And so a big part of this idea, Yarvin calls it the cathedral, that we have a society where things like the media and universities and academia are the real power in society. And they want to create an alternative version of that and destroy the existing cathedral and create their own. And so Yarvin is sort of this pseudo-intellectual figure who's providing this sort of so-called scholarly basis for all of these ideas to be adopted. But as anybody knows who understands history, who's done the reading, or who's an expert, this is all poppycock and gobbledygook. But it also helps explain why the Republicans under Trump are going so hard at our universities right now. In Yarvin's view, we have to undermine all the existing institutions of power and influence and truth, the media, establishment politics, academia, and establish a new version that will promote this ideology. He calls that, basically destroying the cathedral. And it's amazing how many of his ideas seem to be directly popping up in this second Trump administration.